This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Sewing a wool coat seems like a daunting task, but I've done it quite a few times and it's really not as difficult as it looks. Today I'm sharing with you my cut and prep tips, plus walking through the construction process of this coat, and basically showing you how to achieve a professional look with any coat pattern. Today I'm working with the Poppy coat by Make by TFS, and it's an oversized coat and a great beginner pattern, and I'm going to be able to show you some foundational basics with it. My fabric is a wool blend, more medium than heavyweight, and it has a good side and a bad side, so make sure you check that for your fabric. I'm lining it with a Kasha lining, which is a sturdy and thick polyester lining that is quite easy to work with because it's not super drapey and slippery, and it's thicker, so it's warmer. I highly recommend this type of lining for a winter coat. You can source it pretty much anywhere online. The first thing I recommend doing is steaming or ironing the fabric. This will help get a pre-shrink in, and it's also crucial to do before block fusing. Make sure you only iron in one direction, and I would say that should be in the direction of the selvage. This will minimize any warping of the fabric. And I didn't do this, but take note of how your iron interacts with the fabric. If it causes a sheen or discoloration, you may want to use a thin piece of cloth between your fabric and your iron to protect the look of your fabric. Next, very crucial, color code your pattern pieces. Coats usually have 3 textiles involved: the shell, which is the outer, usually wool fabric, the lining, which is the inner, smooth fabric, and the interfacing, which is fusible or non-fusible. I'm using fusible. Fusible just means it fuses, it sticks to the fabric. So I color coded my pattern pieces blue for lining, red for fusing, and this is so important because cutting out something that you don't need might send you back to the fabric store, which would be rather tragic, especially if you have to buy more of your expensive coat fabric. There are a few pieces that need fusible interfacing on the entire surface of the pattern, so what I'm going to do is block fuse, which means to fuse a large piece of fabric with this interfacing and then cut out the pieces from it. This prevents potential shrinkage. It can be less of a headache. Also, a note about pressing fusing. You press and you lift. You don't slide the iron across because the fusible interfacing can shift and warp. I use a medium weight tricot fusing, and I use this for all coats. It's a bit heavier and works really well. And the reason why you want to add interfacing, whether fusible or non-fusible, is to add stabilization to your coat. It will allow certain areas to just hang better and look so much more structured and professional. I have another whole video where I sew a coat and I actually use non-fusible interfacing. It's much more complex. It's really a lot of tailoring techniques. So that could be interesting for you to watch as well, but I don't recommend it for a beginner. I also had to cut out some fusing pieces, but I pressed them to the fabric before cutting the larger pieces, with the exception of the hem strips, which stabilize the hem, and I just pressed them on after cutting. Mark the button placement with a thread instead of just chalk or disappearing pen. It will ensure that the marking is not lost as you sew the garment. It's really annoying to add button placement on at the end. It can be done, but you just have to account for the enclosed seam allowance, and it never seems to line up perfectly with the pattern piece, which annoys me. So doing this ahead of time with a nice sturdy stitch, just a quick loop that's not gonna fall out, is perfect. It can be really helpful to cut out your lining with a cutting mat and rotary blade if you have it, especially if your fabric is pretty slippery, which many linings tend to be. This fabric is Kasha lining, as I said, it's not slippery, so I am using a rotary blade and cutting mat, but I could probably just use scissors as well. And this next tip is leading into construction, but it's so crucial to have this done on every piece needed so that sewing the garment is so much easier and things just fit together better and make sense. So pre-press all of your hems or any areas that need pre-pressing beforehand. Wind a few bobbins to start. Believe me, you don't want to wind a bobbin in the middle of your project, so do that first. I would say at least 2 or 3 is good for a coat project. And then make sure you use a heavier needle, a 14 or a 16. I am using a 16. Lastly, read through the instructions, and if there is a video, which I'm told there is a sew along for this coat, I 100% recommend viewing it once before as well. It's just going to make you feel so much more confident going into it. I have all my shell pieces cut and fused, and I also have all my lining pieces cut, so we are ready to sew. We are starting with a single welt pocket to the front of the coat. I've actually never done a single welt pocket, but I've done many more complex welt pockets, so I know that this will be a breeze. It's also a great first welt pocket to do because it's quite straightforward. So the instructions tell you to start by folding the pocket welts in half with the wrong sides together, and then you're going to sew each welt closed with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. For thicker fabrics, I always recommend increasing the stitch length, and I increase it to 3 stitches per inch. Next, we're going to pin the pocket bearer to the pocket bag, right sides together, and you're going to sew them together with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 seam allowance and press the seam towards the pocket bag. Using the front pattern piece to guide you, you can mark out the welt pocket opening on the right side of the coat front, and I like to use this little chalk wheel. It's the most accurate and easy thing to use. Also, remember to add a block of fusible interfacing to the back of the front coat where that pocket rectangle is. And I don't know why I didn't do this before, but it's actually quite essential to use a press cloth when you're applying fusible interfacing because sometimes the fusible part can make your iron sticky. Next, we're going to mark the ends of the stitching line on the welt piece, and this is 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch in from each short end. Pin the welt piece to the front, aligning the marked stitch lines on the side, aligning your original stitch to the bottom of the rectangle. And here I'm going to zoom out. This is how it should be oriented. The folded edge of the welt will point down towards the hem, towards the center front, and the raw edges will point up and towards the side seam. And then we're going to sew the welt in place along that stitch line, 1 centimeter from the raw edge of the welt, starting and finishing with a back stitch exactly at each end of those chalked guidelines. Now that that's done, we're going to mark the stitching line on the wrong side of the pocket bearer, 1 centimeter from the edge. In the same way, we're going to pin the pocket bearer to the front along the stitch line with right sides together. And this is where I did not realize that I was actually using the opposite pocket bag. The pocket should have been pointing down towards the hem, not up towards the shoulder area. So definitely don't make this mistake. So you're going to sew the pocket bearer along the stitch line at the 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. And just like the welt, we're starting and finishing with a back stitch exactly at each end chalked guideline. Now that that's sewn together, we get to mark the center of the rectangle, and 2 centimeters from each end, we're going to draw a V that ends at each stitch point, and we're going to cut this open. So when you cut to the stitch, just make sure you don't cut through the stitch, cut right to where the end stitch goes. Then this allows you to pull the welt and the pocket bag through to the wrong side, and then you can press along these stitching lines. Next, that little piece of triangle is going to get sewn to the welt. So we're going to fold the front of the coat back to reveal that triangle that was formed when you cut the pocket open, and gently pull it so it sits flat and pin it to the welt. And you can sew the triangle and the welt together along the edge of the pocket opening that you marked at the beginning of this step. Do the same for the other side of the pocket. And then you can give your pocket a nice press and check that all is sitting nicely. And I just want to stress again that pressing is the key to a professional looking coat. Something that looks not like it's like homemade, like you did a little craft at home and ooh, I made this. It's my first project. No, you can press your garment and say with pride, I made this. Yeah, I know it looks like I bought it, but I made it. So, never forget to press and always use that tailor's clapper. If you have one, if you don't have one, get one. Next, we're going to fold the pocket bag in half with the right sides together and pin that free end of the pocket bag to the raw edge of the welt and sew them together at 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. And I don't even know how I didn't realize that this was in the wrong orientation by now, but somehow I didn't, but we're gonna fix that very soon. Then I pressed it. And once I put it down, I realized, oh, the bag is pointing towards the shoulder, not towards the hem like it should. This bag should have been sewn to this construction, with these being the orientation, and this one should have been sewn to this, but I can easily fix it. I can just take this off, take this off, and then flip it around and sew it together the opposite way. You'll see. Okay, so this is how it was. And this is supposed to be parallel with the floor here. So we're just gonna flip it over and we're gonna sew it back to these seams. So sewing it right here. Even though it doesn't have a fusible interfacing like it should, that's okay. It's just for stabilizing. I could add some on, but I'm not going to. And then, yeah, and then I'm just gonna add this one here like I just sewed it on, and then it'll be fixed. I'll do that with the other side. And then it will be done and we can sew the bags together and it will be done. Next, pin the sides of the pockets together and then sew it closed with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And you're not sewing it to the coat, obviously, you're just sewing the pocket bag. So when it comes to the part that's close to the welt area, you're just going to sew the welt pieces to the bag, just like we were doing when we sewed the triangle area. And obviously repeat for the other side to create a wonderful pair of pockets. And seeing it looking like an actual coat reminded me of the wool that I got to make a matching scarf. And I just think this yarn is the perfect color to go with this wool. I actually bought a sweater pattern to make, but after practicing, I realized I needed to start with something simple, and that's why I'm so glad I found this knitting class on Skillshare, which taught me all the basics. I tried following along with some random videos on YouTube, but they don't really compare to a comprehensive, focused, ad-free lesson like this one by Davina Choi, Knitting 1, Learning the Basics with a Simple Scarf. But what is Skillshare? Oh, it's only the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry pros across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. I've taken a look at sewing classes, embroidery classes, photography, graphic design, illustration, and so much more. They've also created something new called Learning Paths, which are hand-picked classes meant to be taken in order that build on one another, reinforcing the lessons. They are available in a range of experience levels from beginner to advanced and a variety of categories, which is really helpful if you don't know where to start. This particular DIY clothing design learning path looks really interesting to me as a sewer, and I can always build on my sewing skills. Skillshare has generously offered a free 1-month trial for the first 500 to click my link below. Thanks, Skillshare. Now, I really love knitting this scarf, but let's get back to the coat. Now we can move on to the sleeves. Now this sleeve is a raglan sleeve, so it has a seam down the top of your arm, and this gives a shaping to the sleeve. What we're going to do is place the front and back sleeve right sides together, pin it in place, matching the notches, and we're going to sew that seam. And then you're going to press it open, and as I've been saying, use that tailor's clapper to really set that seam and make it look really nice and crisp. And I didn't mention the seam allowance, but the seam allowance for everything is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Next, we're going to pin the back side of the sleeve to the back with the right sides together and matching the notches. And then we're going to sew that at 1 centimeter. We'll do the exact same thing for the front. And then I pressed everything, and here it is. The coat is shaping up. Before we sew up the side seams, let's add the undercollar. To prep the coat neck, at each corner on the front, sew a line of stitching 1 centimeter or 3/8 from the edge to reinforce the corners where the collar turns on the front. Then you can clip into the corner to release the seam allowance. This will allow you to more easily sew the corner of the collar. With right sides together, pin the undercollar to the coat body. Start by pinning at the center back, then match the next notch to the shoulder seam of the sleeve. The corner matches to the clipped corner of the coat neck, and the final notch matches at the notch on the coat lapel. Sew this together starting exactly at the lapel notch. It's crucial that you don't go past this, and sew it with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. When we reach that corner, stop with the needle down and raise the presser foot, and then pivot and rearrange your coat so that the seam you're going to sew is laying flat and there's not going to be any puckers sewn in. And then you can continue sewing the rest of the collar. And I sewed with the undercollar on top, but you can also sew with it on the bottom. Just make sure to catch the front piece when you stop with your needle down at each corner. Next, you're going to press the seam open, and the corners of the undercollar will probably need to be folded when you press this seam. Now we can sew up the side seams, so place the coat right sides together and pin the front to the back at the side seams. Match the notches and the seams and sew together. Then make sure you press everything. This is the coat now that the side seams are in. I did misplace the fusible interfacing, so it's kind of down from the top, but it's gonna be okay. Don't do that though. Do it properly. Yeah, I think I would have chosen a slightly thicker fabric maybe. I think it would hang a little bit better, but it's looking pretty good. Yeah, let's get on with it. Now we are on to the lining. So with right sides together, pin the two back lining pieces together and sew the seam at 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. It's shaped like this to give room for shoulder movement, so it will create a pleat. So we'll press the seam to one side, and at the top you can sew the pleat that is created. A good coat pattern will always have something like this incorporated into the lining construction, because if it doesn't, you may end up with the center back seam pulling and maybe coming apart, or if there's no center back seam, it could also be the shoulder seams. So keep that in mind when you're looking for a coat pattern or if you're drafting one yourself. After this, I sewed together the sleeves to the front and back lining. It's almost exactly the same as the coat construction, and I pressed each seam, of course. One thing different is that I left an opening in one of the sleeves so that we can turn out the coat later. Now the lining is ready for the facing. Just like we did with the coat neckline, we're going to sew a line of stitching 1 centimeter from the edge to reinforce the corners, and then clip into that corner to release the seam. Then pin the front facing to the back neck facing at the shoulder seams and sew. After which you will press that seam open. Pin the facing to the lining with the right sides together and matching the notches and seams. Start and end your sewing at the notch halfway down, and I also decided to understitch the seam allowance by pushing the seam allowance towards the lining and sewing on the lining. It looks quite nice. We'll sew the rest of the facing to the lining at a later step. On to the top collar. So with right sides together, pin the top collar to the collar stand, matching all of the notches. And sew the top collar and collar stand together at 6 millimeters or 1/4 inch. I actually sewed it at 1 centimeter 3/8. I didn't see that, but it turned out fine. But do follow the instructions if you're sewing this coat. Once that's done, clip into the top collar seam allowance, and then you can press it open and flat. Much the same as sewing the undercollar to the coat shell, sew the top collar to the facing. So with the right sides together, pin the top collar to the facing, matching all of the notches and matching the corners together. And sew the same as we did with the undercollar. And then press the seam open. The instructions then call for attaching the sleeve lining and shell together, but I think that can become really confusing, so I'm going to actually start with sewing the collar and lapel together. I start with a collar lapel seam and line it up exactly where the stitching ends, then pin the rest together. And when you're going to sew, you're going to move the collar lapel seam allowance out of the way of the side on which you're working and start with a back stitch as close to the original seam as possible, and then sew to the other side and do the exact same for the lapel. The seam allowance of the lapel and collar need to stay out of the way of these seams. You can see I've sewn right close to the collar lapel seam stitch and then back stitched. And now I'm starting again on the collar, moving the seam allowance out of the way to start with a back stitch and continue to the other side where I'll repeat the same steps. Then we're going to trim the curves. I like to use pinking shears because the little triangles that are cut out help the curves to sit really smooth when you turn it out. But if you don't have that, just use regular scissors and trim the curves to 5 millimeters, as the instructions say. Then we're going to turn the coat right side out and give it a press. It is shaping up to look more and more like a coat. And as I press, I'm using my tailor's clapper because if this area is not pressed properly, it's the biggest giveaway that your coat was home crafted in a bad way. This is now where we sew the sleeve hems together. I like to do this by putting the sleeves inside each other, as they would be when you're wearing them, and then align the hems, ensuring nothing is twisted. Then pull these together through the open hem of the coat and pin together seam to seam. Then sew them together. And now our sleeves are done. Then we're going to turn the coat inside out again, and with wrong sides of the collar together, we're going to pin the facing seam allowance to the collar seam allowance. And we're going to sew the facing to the body within the seam allowance to close up the collar. I found it a bit tricky to sew this part because the coat was bulky and the seam where I had to sew was quite narrow. But in situations like these, you just gotta take it slow. I kept checking underneath to make sure I wasn't catching a fold of the fabric into the stitch. And once we turn it out, you can see that the collar neckline seam is secure and it's not going to shift around when you're wearing it. Now it's time to attach the lining at the hem. I have the coat with the bottom facing up right now, and before attaching the lining, at each corner on the coat body at the hem, we're going to sew a line of stitching 1 centimeter or 3/8 from the edge to reinforce the corners. Same thing that we've been doing with the necklines. Then we're going to clip into the corner to release the seam allowance. And you'll see how this comes in handy. Next, with right sides together, pin the lining to the coat body at the hem and sew them together at 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. Then, at each corner of the lining, fold the lining wrong sides together, matching the hem notch to the seam you've just sewn. The pre-pressing steps that you made at the beginning will really help with this, so now you see why you shouldn't skip the pressing. And then baste the fold in place with the seam allowance where the hem steps down on the front. Now we're going to pin the front facing to the front at the hem edge. Fold up the main coat hem 5 centimeters or 2.5 inches, and then pin the hem and the lining to the vertical edge of the front facing. And you're going to pin all the way up to where we left off with the lining and facing. So when you're sewing this, you're going to sew across the hem at the 1 centimeter 3/8. Stop with your needle down 1 centimeter before the edge of the front facing. That's right in the corner where we clipped. And then lift your presser foot, pivot and rearrange all of that fabric out of the way so that you're ready to sew the rest of the facing to the front lining. Lower your presser foot and complete the seam. And then also repeat this for the other side. Now we're going to utilize that hole in the sleeve lining and turn the coat out through that hole. Once I've done that, I go in again, clip the corners of the front hem edge and fold it inside each other and then turn it out nice and crisply. Then give the hems a press and press the lining where we've just attached it to the lower edge of the facing. So where the hems are folded, as per your pre-pressing at the beginning, you're going to align the side seams and ditch stitch about 2 to 3 centimeters at each side seam, making sure that you move the lining out of the way. And ditch stitching is basically just sewing into that seam so that you won't even see the stitch. And you can do the same for the sleeve hem as well. We're also going to do a form of this for the shoulder seam on the sleeve, and so you need to align the shoulder seam on the sleeve and the shoulder seam on the facing under the collar, pin them in place, and then ditch stitch 3 to 4 centimeters to secure the facing. I didn't actually align them very well, but at least they're secured. And my thread matches really well. The coat hem also needs some internal securing between the side seams, otherwise the hem will droop and won't stay crisp. So you can turn out the hem from the gap in the sleeve and blind stitch from side seam to side seam. So you're going to grab a bit of the hem allowance and then a few threads of the fabric about a ½ inch away or so, and then right below where you grabbed those threads, you're going to stitch into the hem allowance again and continue the same pattern. And this blind stitch ensures that you won't even see it on the outside of the coat. Turn your coat right side out once more, and once everything is done, you're sure that the internal seams are all good, you don't have to go back into it, then you can edge stitch the opening of the sleeve closed. You could also hand blind stitch it. Lastly, we're going to do the button and buttonhole. So mark the buttonhole on the right front. I already had a stitch there showing me where it was supposed to start. So I marked my buttonhole according to the width of my button. And then I'm using my sewing machine to sew up the buttonhole. For some reason, it wasn't working at all. I tried it twice and I was very frustrated. Wow. 2 days later, I realized, oh, this is really, really thick thread. And I realized that these tiny stitches were just not accommodating the thread. And so I luckily thought, okay, I'll use a normal thin thread, and it worked perfectly. I'm so glad I thought of that, and I'm glad for your sakes too if you guys are using a thicker embroidery top stitching thread to sew your coat, then just switch it out for maybe something that's a little bit lighter, unless you have a better machine than mine that can handle it. I checked that the coat aligns to my previously marked button placement. In doing this, you should see that the front hems align. Then I sewed the button with a doubled thread. And the coat is pretty much done. I just press it nicely using more steam than pressure so that any internal seams don't show their indent on the outside of the coat. And then we're done.